Welcome. This lecture, we're going to talk about the end times, and we're going to look at both the diversity and also the unity of the New Testament in terms of this topic of the end times. This is also known as eschatology, which is the study of the end times. But we're going to look at a couple of different passages throughout the New Testament, look at some places in which we can have some hints on how or what are the events that will happen at the end of the age. And also, too, we'll look at some aspects in the New Testament that kind of show different perspectives. And some stuff is not as clear as we would like for it to be. But we'll jump into that in our discussion for today. All right. So we'll cover a couple of topics here in the New Testament. But first I want to lay some groundwork on what we mean by eschatology, or at least with this phrase. Like, what does this phrase mean? Eschatology or the end times. Believe it or not, eschatology is not the same as apocalyptic literature. When you're thinking about the end times, sometimes we may think about the apocalypse or some cataclysmic event in the end of the age, and we use the language of apocalyptic or something that's very apocalyptic. I do want to point out that it is similar, but there are some distinctions. When you're looking at apocalyptic literature, this does include the book of Revelation. It is that biblical genre of what we call revelatory literature. So apocalyptic literature will cover stuff in the end time. So like the book of Revelation does discuss things that are going to happen at the end of the age. For example, the new heaven and the new earth. You do see that in apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation. But the book of Revelation is not all about the end of the age. The book of Revelation is also about the present, and the book of Revelation also has stories about the past. And so apocalyptic literature as a literary genre will include both the end times, discussion about the end times, but it also discusses stuff about the present moment of the writer of John the seer, and also discusses things about the past, Israel's history and past. And so apocalyptic literature, or at least this apocalyptic language that sometimes is used to describe the end time, it is not the same thing as eschatology. When we're thinking about eschatology, we're talking specifically about the end times, the very end. What are those events that are going to happen at the end of the age? Now, when you look at the New Testament, you will see discussions about the end of the age. And you see these discussions in several portions of the New Testament, but they all include like some recurring themes or characters and events. For example, there is a discussion about false prophets. At the end of the age, there will be a rise in false prophets. You also see discussions about the Antichrist. But I use this in the singular form, but in reality, it's a plural. In the Johannine letters, it's the Antichrist. There's many of them. But you do have within popular imagination or end time imagination an understanding of some particular figure. Also, in the end of the age, there's this expectation there's going to be some great persecution or tribulation. Likewise, a day of judgment, and also to the resurrection and the new heaven and new earth. So, overall, when we're talking about eschatology, or at least what does the New Testament say about the end of the age, these are some themes that you will notice. And so eschatology includes these themes, and there's a lot more as well, but these are just a few. The question now is for us, where do we find what the Bible says or what the New Testament says about the end times? It is not specifically like in one particular book of the Bible. We do have the book of Revelation, but as I mentioned earlier, the book of Revelation as apocalyptic literature includes stuff about the past and about the present and also about the future. So it's not just all about the end of the age. But when we're looking in the New Testament in general, just the New Testament, uh, we find a lot of eschatological passages or discussions about the end of the age in key places. I want to point out just a couple, or at least the more popular ones. First of all, we have what is called the Olivet Discourse. These are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is in the Synoptic Gospel. These are Jesus' teachings about the end of the age. And it's called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus is on the Mount of Olives giving this discussion. Now, it is only found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So you get specifically Jesus' teaching on the end times only in these passages here. You see this specifically. It is different in the Gospel of John, because in the Gospel of John, you don't see Jesus sitting on the mountain olive and giving his discussion about the end times. John's Gospel and the letters of John are a bit different. There's no Olivet discourse. There's no Jesus telling the disciples the signs of the end. And you don't really see any prediction about the end of the world in the Gospel of John. In fact, the eschatology in the Gospel of John is more realized. That's what scholars call it, which means that it does not refer to the future, like some event in the future, but it's more about the present. It's a present realized eschatology. And likewise, when you get to the letters of John, you don't really see discussions about one particular person who is going to rise up and have a one world order as a antichrist. You don't really have that. What you have instead is the spirit of the antichrist. So in Johannine eschatological thinking, the antichrist is a spirit, and there's many of them. It is basically a spirit that denies the incarnation of Jesus. Whoever does not confess and believe that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, that is the spirit of the Antichrist. That was present during the time of John, the letter writer, and still present today. But that's how they describe the Antichrist. So John's gospel and the letters are a bit different. They have this more of a realized eschatology. The day of judgment happens on the day that you confess and believe. So it's like the present. Um, it's a little bit different. You don't see Jesus having some teachings about the end of the age. That scenario is only found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Olivet Discourse. And then we also have Paul's letters. Now, Paul's letters also discuss the end of the age, and Paul actually thought that he was living at the end of age, at the end of the age. You see Paul thinking that Jesus was going to return like right away, that the night was ending and the day was about to begin. And so you do see these themes and assumptions within Paul's letters. But more specifically, there are two letters of Paul where you really get to see what he thought about the end of the age. And this is in Paul's letters to the Thessalonians. In Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, he does describe the coming of Jesus. That is very similar to Jesus's Olivet Discourse, when Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming down from heaven with his angels to execute judgment on the world. That imagery in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 is very similar to what we see in First and Second Thessalonians. And I believe it's in Second Thessalonians 1 where Paul adds a little comment about Jesus coming down from heaven in blazing fire. So that's this like really cosmic celestial signs. Um, but more specifically, this is perhaps something or Paul's contribution to our understanding of the end times. Paul discusses a specific person. He calls him the man of lawlessness. Now, this is a figure, we have no idea who he is. There's debate within scholarship on exactly who this figure is. Is it Caligula? Is it, and the Roman Emperor Nero? Is it Antioch Epiphanes? Is Paul thinking about the arch enemies of Israel's past, or is he thinking about the Roman Emperor himself? We don't know. And in fact, Paul gives specific details about this figure, that this person's going to call himself God. He's gonna be very I don't want to say blasphemous, but he's gonna be very arrogant, and he's gonna sit in the temple of God. So you get this really like this like, oh my goodness, this is gonna be a specific figure who's gonna be in the temple of the Lord. He's gonna call himself God and all this stuff. So it's this man of lawlessness. Who is this figure? I don't know, but Paul does emphasize that the end of the age will not come until this person shows up. But right now, he's being restrained. And who the heck knows who that restrainer is? Is the restrainer God? Is it the restrainer the Roman government? Is it restrainer angels? We have no idea who Paul's referring to with this restrainer language. And another thing that Paul does discuss in his letter to the Thessalonians is the rapture. So this is what you see in his letter, and he's discussing this departure, or this meeting of Christ in the air. Now, I want to put a button on this, because this is such a, oh man. Oh. What Paul means is probably not what popular Christian folk theology understands. I just want to put a note on that. Paul's understanding of the rapture has been has changed a lot since dispensational theology, since Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, since the Left Behind series with Kirk Cameron and all these other books and stuff like that. So there has been a lot of harm done to a biblical understanding of this concept, which is unfortunately very, very prominent today. And another thing that Paul does discuss, and this is where we find in First Corinthians, is Paul's discussion about the resurrection of the dead. This is very important. This is a key thing in a lot of or in Paul's discussion about the end of the age, because the resurrection is big. It is like, if Jesus did not have a physical human body, there is no resurrection. So the resurrection of the dead is closely connected to the incarnation of Jesus. The fact that Jesus became a real human testifies and demonstrates that Jesus died a physical death. It was a real death. And as a result of pain and consequences of sin and death, like, we have hope in a raised body. So Jesus defeated death itself. So this is what you see in Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So this whole notion of resurrection of the dead, this is just not a funeral theology that we remember every time there's a funeral. No, this is crucial. It's connected to so much more. It's connected to his understanding of the Holy Spirit, understanding of Jesus' identity, his sacrifice that he did on the cross. There's so much that this is intertwined with it. So it's not just like something that we just add on to the end because we're all going to eventually die. But the resurrection is crucial, gives us a hope that is beyond hope, beyond all the hope that was known and received during this time period. And besides Paul's letters, the Gospel of John and John's letters, or the Olivet Discourse and the Synoptic Gospels, we have the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation gives us this satanic trinity of the dragon, the false prophet, the beast of the sea, and you also get the mark of the beast. You also have discussions about the day of judgment, new heaven and earth, the millennial reign. There's so much in the book of Revelation that it is in itself, it is its own course on end time eschatology. But as you can notice right away, there are different perspectives on the end of the age and what will happen. Even on the villains, like who's going to really appear. Notice that, you know, for John, there are the spirit of the Antichrist. So for John, there's no like one singular Antichrist, it's many Antichrists, and it's a spirit. For Paul, it's a man of lawlessness. In the book of Revelation, you have the beast that comes out from the sea, the false prophet, and the dragon. So you have that satanic trinity. Um, so it's a little bit different for different writers, but this is generally the particular passages in the New Testament that we go to, or at least specific books in the New Testament that we go to when we're thinking about the end times. So it leaves me to, or at least leads me to this question. And this is perhaps a question for us always to reflect. And I do think about this question, even more so now than ever. Do you think that we are living in the end times? Um, why or why not? There are a couple of things I do want to discuss. I may not be able to discuss them all, but we'll see where we go with our time together. But I do want to talk at least about the second coming of Christ, the rapture, how that's related to that, the tribulation, also the millennial reign. This is also connected to that, and the Antichrist, or the man of lawlessness, if we go through this as well. But these are certain themes that do emerge when we're thinking about like the end of the age and the specific either events or texts in the New Testament that reveal to us how this will manifold. I do want to point out that majority of this is primarily coming from the Olivet Discourse or from the letters of Paul. So there's a lot there. And then the book of Revelation also has like its own timetable, so to speak, when we're looking about the end of the age. But we'll first start with the second coming of Christ. Now, all gospel writers, like regardless of where you are at or what you read, they all recognize that Jesus is going to return in a physical manner. So it's not a spiritual return. So it's not a type of return that is personal and individualized. It's a return for that will be present, literal, physical, visible to all people. So we see this in Matthew, we see this in John, we see this in the book of Acts, we see this in the letters of Paul as well. So it's not a spiritual return, but it's a real physical return to earth in a manner that also resembles his first coming. But his return is not just to come on earth and to minister or do what he did the first time. It is a return that signals the end of the age and the judgment of the world. So it's a return that inaugurates the judgment of God. Paul also emphasized the return of Christ. We see this in First Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 13. He describes it as such. May he strengthen your hearts so that you will be blameless and holy in the presence of our God and Father when our Lord Jesus, when he comes with all of his holy ones. And he uses this word called the Parousia. The return of Jesus in the letters to the Thessalonians is going to rescue us from the coming wrath. His return is also called an apocalypse. It is a revealing in which Jesus will emerge with blazing fire. And we also see his return coming with his holy angels and power and glory. And as we find also in the Olivet Discourse, the end of the age, it will be like a thief in the night. And overall, we can see some similarities with Jesus' teachings in Matthew 24 and also Luke and Mark, where Paul does emphasize that Jesus' return is going to be certain, visible, it's going to have cosmic signs. Jesus is going to return with angels, and he will rescue believers from that day of wrath or the day of judgment. So, this is what we could see. But then this kind of leads to the notion of a rapture. And we find this also in the letter to the Thessalonians. We will meet Christ in the air in a bodily resurrection. This is the word rapture. It's that special moment when all of us who are still alive be taken up into the air to meet Christ. Now, this is mentioned briefly or alluded to in the Gospels, but it's more specific in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. And this is a passage in Thessalonians 4:17. It says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with the cry of command, with the archangel's call, with the sound of the trumpets of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever." This is similar to what we see here in Matthew, wherein you also see the languages. You have the appearing of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. People will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the angels will, with a loud trumpet call, they'll gather the elect and from one end to the other. So there's this gathering of the elect or the gathering of the people of God. It is not really fleshed out in Matthew or Mark or in Luke, but in some ways it is somewhat similar to Paul's language here in Thessalonians. But what's this relationship, though, between the coming of Jesus and this rapture event that is very well known and believed? Here we have a particular picture. So if you can imagine, this is a scenario that Paul paints. Jesus is coming down from heaven on his clouds. There is this general resurrection. There's a resurrection of the dead. You see this in verse 16. Believers were raptured into the air. This is in verse 17. And this language for rapture comes from that Greek word harpazo, which means to be caught up. And then in verse 17 it makes mention that we will meet the Lord in the clouds, in the air, and will be with him forever. What you don't see in this passage is any mention of some 7-year period in heaven, which is a very common and popular dispensational view of the end time. Um, Paul, however, he views the end times or the second coming in light of Jesus's parousia. Um, and so when we're thinking about like how is this going to look like, um, Paul has actually something specific in mind. He's thinking about a particular event that was very popularly known in the Roman period and even during the Greek period as well, and it's called a parousia. And I won't go through these questions, but I want us to focus on this notion of a parousia. This is the coming. This is that Greek word that describes the coming of the Lord. And we actually perhaps have a very, very close parallel to the second coming of Christ when we look at the coming of kings and royal officials whenever they view a city. So there's this one passage in the writings of Josephus. And in the writings of Josephus, he makes mention of the parousia or the coming of Alexander the Great and how Alexander first visited the city. So I'm going to read these paragraphs in total, just so you can kind of understand a bit of what this is really talking about. So this is Josephus. He's writing about the visitation of Alexander the Great. And so it starts in the following. It says now Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, he made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And Judah the high priest, when he heard that, he was in agony and under terror, not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians. And since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience, he therefore ordained that the people should make supplications and should join him in the offerings sacrificed to God, whom he besought to protect the nation and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream, which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage, adorn the city, open the gates, and the rest should appear in white garments, but that he and the priest should meet the king in the clothes proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequence, which the providence of God would prevent. Upon which, when he rose from his sleep, he greatly rejoiced, and he declared to all the revelation he had received from God, according to which dream he acted entirely, and so waited for the coming of the king. So here you find in this story, Alexander the Great, he is going to come to Jerusalem. Now, the Jewish people, especially Jadua, the high priest, he was scared. He's like, oh my goodness, the Greeks are going to Jerusalem. What are we going to do? They are going to destroy the city because there already was well known. Alexander the Great was conquering everyone, Babylon, Egypt, and he was now passing through Jerusalem. So the high priest was scared and he was worried. So, like, hey, let us seek the Lord. And so they were afraid of the coming of the king. And so they sought the Lord. And in when they were seeking the Lord and offering sacrifices, he had a vision. And the Lord spoke to him. And the Lord told him, hey, don't worry, clothe yourselves, prepare yourselves, go out and get ready to meet the king in your proper clothing. So notice here the scenario. The king is coming to the city. The people inside the city are terrified. God reveals to the high priest and tells them, prepare yourself for the coming of the king. Put on your clothes, dress up nice, and get ready to go and meet the king outside the city gates. And so I'll continue the story. And when he understood that he was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the city citizens. Procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name translated to Greek signifies a prospect, for you have there a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought that they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the gold plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name, and first greeted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice, greet Alexander and surround him, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and they supposed him disordered in his mind. So notice in this part of the story, Alexander the Great comes to the city, and all of the people went out of the city walls and they greeted Alexander the Great. They basically were out there ready to welcome him, ready to just, kind of like in a very, very positive and gracious manner host him. And Alexander the Great, when he was going to the city of Jerusalem, his intent was to destroy that city. But because he saw the people out ready to welcome him, he changed his mind. And so Alexander, because he was welcomed by the priests, He was welcomed by the people, and they were out ready to host him. Overall, he changed his disposition. And instead of him coming to the city to destroy it, he came to the city and he adored the name of God. And that baffled everyone. Like, what? This is a short story and is found in the writings of Josephus. And he includes this description of the visitation of Alexander the Great, this Macedonian who did not destroy the city of Jerusalem, but came and adored and worshiped the name of God. This portrayal here, this is what Paul is thinking about when you're thinking about the rapture. And in fact, Jesus actually did this in his first coming. We know this as the triumphal entry. This is from Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11. This is Jesus. This is in Gospels. As they approached Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey there, donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet, say to daughter Zion, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt, and the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, placed their coats on them for Jesus to sit on, and a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of them and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Notice the same thing happening here. You have Jesus, the King, coming to the city, and he is being greeted and welcomed by some in the city. The people come out of the city, they meet him on a road, as you can see in verse 8. They went out, they put their cloaks on the road, they cut branches from the tree, and they basically welcome Jesus. And they shout out and they call him the Son of David. And what Jesus does in this triumphal entry, we celebrate also as Palm Sunday. This is basically Jesus' first coming, his entrance into the city. This is his triumphal entrance. This is a procession that a king does whenever he goes and visits the city. So when we're thinking about Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, what Paul means by the rapture, what Paul is doing, he's viewing the second coming of Jesus, just like the manner in which a king visits a city. Now, what happens in both the triumphal entry and the visitation of Alexander the Great? The people that are within the city sit the city and they go out to meet the king and escort the king back into the city. And this is what Paul's doing here. What he's trying to explain. As Jesus comes and returns, we are caught up in the air to meet Jesus and to escort Jesus back down to earth. So when we're talking about a rapture, this is not a rapture to escape earth or to disappear from the earth. This is another way of thinking about us as believers escorting the King Christ back down onto earth. And this was a very common way of thinking about a parousia, the welcoming of a king. We see this in the triumphal entry, and we also see this with the welcome of Alexander the Great. Failure to greet the king before he enters, or to not properly welcome the king, will invite the king or the person who is visiting to come back with his army and destroy the city. And so there are instances in which people were not properly greeted, whether it's Roman generals or military kings. And if they were not properly greeted the first time, they came back and they brought their army. What type of coming do we expect when Jesus returns for the second time? Well, I could say this. We know what happened to him the first time. When he came to Jerusalem, they killed him. So the second coming of Jesus, for some, not all, it won't be a good day. It will be a dreadful day. That's why the second coming of Jesus, for some, it will be a day of hope, a day in which we glorify and we see God, and we see Jesus, we're going to be with him forever. But for others, it's going to be a day of judgment. And both of those two things can be true at the same time. Another aspect that is related to this um, is a millennial reign of Christ. Because when Jesus comes back and he is here on earth, we only find in the book of Revelations, chapter 20, verses 1 through 4, this 1,000-year reign of Jesus, which is very interesting. Uh, it's not the only time in which we see some type of reign of a Christ. We do find in fourth Ezra the mention of a Messiah who's going to reign for 400 years. But the book of Revelation has a 1,000-year reign. This is from Revelation chapter 20. It's the only place in the New Testament where we actually see some type of reign of Jesus that's limited for 1,000 years. Um, and during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the angel binds Satan for 1,000 years. During this 1,000-year reign, those who were martyred, kind of, you had like this first resurrection, and then after the 1,000-year reign, Satan is released again to deceive the nations and lead them to rebel now, like a final battle of Armageddon. You find this in Revelation 20:29. God destroys them with the fire from heaven. And then you find at the very end, at the end of that 1,000-year reign, God throws the devil, the beast, false prophet, basically all the enemies of God into the lake of fire. And then after that, then there's this other, it's called the second resurrection. All the people are judged before the great white throne of Christ. And basically, anyone whose name was not found in the book of life are thrown into the lake of fire, including death and Hades. And so when you're looking at the book of Revelation, the timeline can get a bit complicated. And this is perhaps where some of us are like, I don't know. Jesus is coming. That's all we need to know. Um, when you're looking at Revelation 20, you see this chronology of the 1,000-year reign, the first resurrection, saints reign with Christ. You have this millennial reign. Satan is released, the Satan's cast into the fire, the second resurrection, and then you have a final judgment. What is difficult, though, is trying to make sense of this chronology in light of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, and also Paul's description of the rapture and the second coming of Christ in First and Second Thessalonians. Because if you layer this all together, that's when it gets a bit complicated. Uh, and then that's where you get like different perspectives. Especially when they try to present a unifying view of these different timelines. There are some who believe, they're called premillennialists, that Christ will return before the millennial reign of Christ, and so you have like a rapture. So this happens like way before the 1,000-year reign. This is generally accompanied with a pre-tribulation rapture theology. Others view the rapture happening at the end of the tribulation. So this happens like after the persecution. Um, There's another view, there's called a amillennial eschatology, that this whole notion of 1,000-year reign is just really symbolic, refers to the present age. Jesus is technically reigning from heaven. And I guess you would say the first binding of Satan was when it was at the cross. The judgment of the world will happen at the end of the age. And then there's a more other optimistic view called the post-millennials, that Christ is going to return after the millennial reign. So this is a more recent view, to be honest with you. It's a very optimistic view of history that we are basically going to live in this new, ushering in this new golden age of 1,000-year reign. Uh, but this period does end with the return of Christ and the judgment on the world. So it is get a little bit complicated when it comes to thinking about how do we make sense of these timelines. One thing that also comes up, it's very important to notice, is that the New Testament does insist that there's going to be an intense period of tribulation. I want to point out there are two words that are used. You will always notice that whenever it's in reference to Christians, this term is used a lot. Thelixis, which is translated as persecution. This is like this great tribulation that we go through. So this is in Mark 13 that there's going to be this day of suffering. Or in Matthew 24, there's going to be a great distress. Matthew 24:29 is after the distress, there's these cosmic signs. Or in John 16:33, it says, in this world you will face thelipsis. You will face this intense persecution. Or in 2 Thessalonians 1:6, it is only just for God to repay with affliction those who thelipsis, those who afflict you. So this language here, this term thelipsis, it's translated as suffering, as distress, as persecution or affliction. But this is all the same Greek term to describe the persecution and suffering that believers go through. Um, and you see this also in the book of Revelation. We go through this intense tribulation. And in Revelation, there are some who actually go through this tribulation and die as martyrs. There's this period. But notice here, not only from Revelations to Mark, but it's believers are promised to go through very difficult periods of persecution. So this is something that we should expect. No one is going to be spared from some type of persecution. We cannot, however, confuse it with the notion of wrath. And likewise, we have to think about, well, when does this persecution happen? You find in Revelation, this is the persecution that believers experience. In Matthew and Mark, this persecution, this is what we experience before the coming of Christ. Paul also assumes that we are all going to go through this persecution or this tribulation. But we cannot confuse this again with the notion of the day of God's wrath. We are promised not to experience the wrath of God. This is a different word. This is the word orge, the wrath of God. The wrath of God comes on the day of judgment. And you see this also likewise throughout the New Testament. In John 3:36, it says, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever disobeys the Son will not see life, but must endure God's orge, God's wrath. Likewise, Romans 5:9. Now that we have been justified by his blood, we will be saved through him from the orge, the wrath of God. Or in Colossians, likewise, the wrath of God is coming to those who are disobedient. Or in Thessalonians 5:9, this is perhaps the most clearest one. It says, for God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So notice, at the day of Christ's second coming, it will be a day of judgment. It will be a day of wrath. For some, it will be the great dreadful day of the Lord. But for others, for believers, it will be a day of glory, a day that we are saved from the elite system, the persecution that we are experiencing as a result of being in the world. So this is crucial. There is this recognition that we will go through a tribulation. You see this in the Gospels and letters of Paul and Revelation. But what we won't go through is the day of God's wrath. That is different. And likewise, we also see this phrase, the Antichrist. This occurs in the letters of John. And I'll go through this very briefly. You see that there's this Antichrist is coming. The Antichrist is the one who denies the Father and the Son, but there's also the spirit of the Antichrist. There's many of them that are present that are denying the coming of Jesus, the first coming of Jesus. So that's the Antichrist. It's the spirit of Antichrist that denies the incarnation, the identity of Jesus. But in Paul and in Revelation, you get these two other figures. In Paul, you have this man of lawlessness. He needs to be revealed before the return of the Lord. He's going to exalt himself above God. He's going to sit in God's temple. He's going to proclaim himself to be God. And he's also going to be a miracle worker. So watch out for anyone who does miracles. Like, that is not a sign that they are God's anointed. Be careful. That is just something. Like, once I start seeing someone doing miracles and, calling themselves God, I'm like, okay, I'm stocking up on cans and everything. I'm going to go in my bunker or something. That is one crucial sign that this is the man of lawlessness. This person is doomed to destruction. Jesus will overthrow him. John, the seer in the book of Revelation, describes him as a beast. The beast emerges from the sea, which could refer to the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire just come up from the sea. Could refer to like a single specific individual. It's very, you know, I don't know. It's interesting in the book of Revelation. But overall, whether it's the Antichrist or the man of lawlessness or the beast, this is a particular person who claims to be Christ. He rages war against the Christ, against the saints. He claims to be God's anointed. So just be very careful, any self-proclaimed person or anyone who claims to be the anointed one. I worry at times, and so, but we will have many false messiahs and many people that will emerge. Jesus promises us that in Matthew 24 that there would be many Christs who come and proclaim themselves to be the Christ, and so, but this is also something that we see, and the resurrection. I'll just conclude with this last one. We always recognize that this is something very crucial. Um, the early Christians are recognizing that Jesus not only lived, but he died and he rose from the grave. The dead, even those who have passed away, will rise again, will have new resurrected bodies. And I like this passage in 1 Corinthians 15:54. The perishable has been clothed with imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. Then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. This is perhaps, well, one thing that I really do appreciate when it comes to the new age, because unless you experience like chronic illness or disability or sickness, and there's something about it, the resurrected bodies, because this body that we have, this frail body that gets tired, that gets sick and fatigued and hurt and injured, there's this you have this hope for a new resurrected body, which will be different from the one that we have right now. I'll just stop right here. Couple questions for reflections. What's the biggest question you still have? And how can understanding the end times help us in our faith and daily life?